Chains clattered on the stone floor, but no one heard them over the music. In the grand hall, candles flickered, violins played, and guests raised their silver goblets in celebration. It was a wedding day, meant for joy and feasting. Yet deep in the kitchen, a slave stirred her pots with trembling hands, hands that carried revenge. Every dish, every drink was laced with silent death. By midnight, the laughter would turn to screams. What happened next shocked everyone. The year was 1829, and the Louisiana sun burned hot over sprawling cotton fields that seemed to stretch forever. The air was thick with humidity, heavy with the smell of soil and sweat. This land, lush and fertile, belonged to the Beaumont family, one of the wealthiest plantation dynasties in the parish. To outsiders, their plantation was a picture of elegance. White columns, grand verandas, the sound of laughter and music spilling from the great house. But behind that facade, in the kitchens, fields, and quarters, it was a world built on chains. Here lived Marianne, a young slave girl who had never known freedom. She was born into bondage, her very first breath claimed by the Beaumonts. Her earliest memories were not of toys or lullabies, but of iron pots bubbling over flames and her mother's weary hands kneading dough. From the moment she could walk, Marianne had been at her mother's side in the kitchen, fetching water, grinding corn, scrubbing floors. The kitchen became both her cage and her classroom. Her mother, Sarah, was a cook too, clever with spices, gentle in spirit, and endlessly patient despite the weight of her chains. Sarah taught her daughter everything she knew. How to make bread rise soft and golden, how to stretch a small portion of meat into a meal, how to balance bitterness with sweetness so even the harshest master would lick his lips in approval. But Sarah also taught her something else, whispered at night by the dying embers. Every dish carries a story, Marianne. And sometimes, food can speak louder than words. Marianne clung to those words, though she did not yet understand their full meaning. The mistress of the house, Eleanor Beaumont, was a woman of rigid pride. She demanded perfection in everything, the shine of the silverware, the polish of the floors, the taste of her meals. To her, slaves were not people, they were tools, extensions of her will. If the roast was too dry, Marianne's mother was whipped. If a cake fell flat, Marianne herself might be slapped across the face. Eleanor's cruelty was sharp and cold, delivered not in bursts of rage, but in calculated strikes meant to remind the enslaved of their place. The master, Charles Beaumont, was no better. He wore charm like a mask, smiling when visitors came, speaking kindly of his servants. But when the doors closed, his laughter grew cruel. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and treated the lives of slaves as disposable. To him, Marianne was not a girl, not a human being, she was property, no different from the horses in his stables. And then there was the overseer, James Cutter, a man whose name itself inspired dread. Tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes like cold steel, he ruled the fields with his whip. His voice carried over the cotton rows, barking orders, followed by the crack of leather and the cries of those too slow to obey. Cutter's cruelty was not just duty, it was pleasure. He enjoyed breaking spirits, enjoyed the fear that spread whenever he entered the kitchen. For Marianne, the kitchen should have been a refuge compared to the endless fields. But Cutter never let her forget her place. He would stride in, demanding food faster, mocking her if she trembled, threatening her when no one was watching. Sometimes he grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises. Sometimes he whispered vile threats that made her blood run cold. And yet, through all this, Marianne's skills grew. She became the unseen architect of the Beaumonts' lavish dinners. Roasted pheasants with herbs, pies so sweet they made guests sigh with delight, stews that warmed the bones on cold nights, all bore her touch. Guests often complimented Eleanor on her divine taste, never realizing the true creator was the quiet slave girl in the kitchen shadows. But Marianne knew her talents were chains in disguise. The more skilled she became, the more the Beaumonts relied on her. They would never let her go. Freedom was a dream too distant to imagine. Still, Marianne had her small moments of rebellion, hidden, subtle, known only to her. Sometimes, when Eleanor demanded a dish fit for royalty, Marianne would season it with a pinch of bitterness, too faint for the tongue, but enough to satisfy her own heart. Sometimes she whispered curses into the dough as she kneaded it, imagining her words sinking deep into the Beaumonts' stomachs. It was foolish, powerless magic, but it kept her spirit from breaking. And then came the night that changed everything. Her younger brother, Samuel, was only 13. Small, wiry, with eyes that still carried hope. Unlike Marianne, who had learned to keep her head down, Samuel sometimes resisted. He hated Cutter, hated the whip, hated the endless rows of cotton. He dreamed of escape, of running north, though Marianne always begged him to stay silent. One evening, Cutter caught Samuel lingering too long at the water barrel. "Lazy rat," he snarled, dragging him toward the stables. Marianne begged for mercy, falling to her knees. But Cutter only laughed. That night, Samuel did not return. Days later, his body was found half buried in the dirt behind the stables, his back torn raw from lashes. The Beaumonts dismissed it easily. "The boy was insolent," Charles said with a shrug. Eleanor simply scolded Marianne for crying while she served tea. Samuel's death was nothing to them, an inconvenience, a trivial note in the endless ledger of their cruelty. But to Marianne, it was the breaking point. Something inside her, long simmering, finally boiled over. She remembered her mother's whispered words. "Food can speak louder than words." And in that moment, Marianne understood. She could not fight Cutter with strength. She could not escape the Beaumonts' chains by running north. But she could use the one power she had, the kitchen, the food, the trust the family placed in her hands every single day. She began to listen more closely to the older slaves, especially the healers. They knew the plants, the roots, the herbs that could heal fever or stop a heart. Foxglove leaves that could slow a pulse until it ceased. Nightshade berries, sweet yet deadly. Even the rat poison Cutter ordered for vermin could be ground fine and hidden in a stew. Marianne learned in silence, storing each fragment of knowledge like a weapon. She practiced patience, waiting for her moment. And then, in the spring of 1830, that moment arrived. Clarissa Beaumont, the eldest daughter of the house, was to be married. The wedding would be the grandest celebration the plantation had ever seen. Guests from across Louisiana would come, plantation owners, wealthy merchants, even local politicians. The house would glow with candles, filled with laughter, music, and dancing. And at the heart of it all, the feast. A feast Marianne would cook. It was her stage, her opportunity, her chance to speak through food one final, terrible message. For the first time, Marianne felt something close to hope. Not the soft hope of freedom, but the sharp, cold hope of vengeance. Her brother would not be forgotten. The Beaumonts would pay. And she would deliver her revenge in the sweetest, most unforgettable way, through the very dishes they trusted her to make. But how exactly she planned to do it would be darker than anyone could imagine. The weeks leading up to the Beaumont wedding were filled with chaos. From the moment the first rooster crowed until long after the moon had risen, the plantation pulsed with activity. The slaves worked without pause, polishing silver until their fingers bled, hauling crates of wine, scrubbing floors until they gleamed. And at the center of this storm was Marianne, trapped in the kitchen, her hands blistered from constant labor. The mistress, Eleanor Beaumont, was relentless. She stalked the halls like a hawk, her sharp voice cutting through the air. "The cakes must be perfect, Marianne. Do you hear me? Not a crumb out of place. The roast must be tender, the bread golden. If you fail, you will wish you had never been born." Her words were not empty threats. Marianne had learned long ago that Eleanor's punishments came swift and merciless. A burnt crust once cost Marianne 3 lashes across her back. A misplaced dish had earned her a night locked in the cold smokehouse, rats scratching at the door as she shivered in the dark. This time, with guests of wealth and power arriving, Eleanor's cruelty was sharpened. The master, Charles Beaumont, took a different approach. He lounged with a drink in hand, chuckling as he watched his slaves scramble. "This wedding must be the talk of Louisiana," he declared. "We will show them all the strength of the Beaumont name." He spoke of strength as though it were measured in chandeliers and wines imported from France, not in the broken bodies of the enslaved. To him, Marianne was no different from the silver goblets he polished for his guests, a possession, a tool to flaunt. But the true shadow over Marianne's life was not the master or mistress, it was the overseer, James Cutter. He prowled the plantation with his whip coiled at his side, always ready, always watching. Cutter made no effort to hide his disdain for the enslaved. "You're nothing," he would hiss, leaning down until his foul breath brushed Marianne's cheek. "A dog at the table, that's all you are." Cutter took special pleasure in tormenting her during the preparations. He would storm into the kitchen, snatch bread from her trays, and toss it to the floor just to see her scramble. He shoved her against counters, mocked her trembling, and once pressed the edge of his knife against her palm as he sneered, "Don't slip, girl, or I'll slice more than vegetables." Each insult, each bruise, each cruel laugh only fueled Marianne's resolve. Beneath her bowed head and quiet, "Yes, sir," her rage burned hotter. She thought of her brother Samuel, his body broken by Cutter's hand, and the fire in her heart roared. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Late at night, when the kitchen was finally quiet, she would sit on the wooden stool near the embers of the fire, clutching the ladle in her hands. Her mind raced. Could she truly do this? Could she lace the Beaumont's feast with poison and watch them writhe? What if she was caught? What if another slave was blamed? She had seen it before, slaves hanged from trees, their lifeless bodies swaying in the night wind, punished for crimes they did not commit. She imagined the coarse rope tightening around her own neck, imagined the crowd of guests watching her execution, their faces twisted with satisfaction. She could almost hear Cutter's voice sneering, "That's what happens to uppity girls who forget their place." But when she closed her eyes, she saw Samuel. She saw his smile, bright with mischief. She saw his body, broken in the dirt. And she remembered the Beaumonts' laughter at his death, their indifference, their dismissal of his life as though it meant nothing. In those moments, her doubt hardened into resolve. She began her secret preparations. Every chance she found, Marianne stole moments to gather what she needed. From the herb garden, she plucked foxglove leaves and carefully dried them in a cloth hidden beneath her mattress. From the pantry, she stole a pouch of rat poison left for vermin. At night, while others slept, she ground nightshade berries into a fine, bitter powder. Each ingredient she collected was tucked away in a small jar beneath the loose floorboard in the kitchen corner. To others, she appeared tired, obedient, overworked like every other slave. But inside, she was sharpening a blade invisible to the world. The whispers among the slaves only heightened her determination. They spoke in hushed voices of the wedding, of the wealthy guests, the grand music, the endless food they would never taste. Some dreamed aloud of slipping away in the chaos, of escape into the woods. But Marianne stayed silent. Her dream was not escape. Her dream was revenge. And the closer the wedding day drew, the more unbearable life became. On the eve of the ceremony, Eleanor Beaumont stormed into the kitchen. She struck Marianne across the cheek with the back of her hand for daring to look too long at the wedding cake. Blood welled at Marianne's lip, but she said nothing. She bent, wiped the blood on her apron, and returned to her work. In her silence, Eleanor saw submission. In truth, Marianne was memorizing the side of Eleanor's face, imagining it twisted in agony, pale with poison. That night, Cutter cornered her outside the smokehouse. He gripped her wrist so tightly she nearly cried out. "Don't you dare ruin tomorrow," he snarled, his eyes glinting with menace. "If you so much as spill a cup of wine, I'll see you buried alive before the sun sets." He released her with a shove, laughing as she stumbled. Buried alive. The words echoed in her skull as she crept back to the quarters. Cutter thought he was terrifying her into obedience. He did not realize he had only given her another vision, himself, choking and gasping, brought low by her hand. When the morning came, Marianne stood at the kitchen table surrounded by platters, pots, and bowls. She ran her hands over the ladles, the knives, the trays polished to silver gleam. Above her head, the mistress barked orders, the overseer prowled, the master drank, the slaves hurried. But Marianne heard only her own heartbeat. Tomorrow, the Beaumonts would sit at their wedding feast. Tomorrow, the overseer would laugh, the mistress would gloat, the master would boast. And tomorrow, Marianne would make them all choke on their arrogance. The stage was set. The poison was ready. And once the first bite was taken, there would be no turning back. But the question that haunted her most was this: would her revenge bring her freedom? Or her death? The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky as blue as polished glass. From the moment the first bell rang, the Beaumont plantation roared to life. Servants scurried, guests arrived in carriages that rattled along the dirt road, and laughter spilled across the veranda like spilled wine. The air was thick with the smell of roses, perfume, and roasting meats. To the outside world, it was a day of joy, of elegance, of promise. But to Marianne, it was the day her plan would finally take root. She rose before the sun. As always, the kitchen was alive with fire and motion, pots clanging, knives chopping, steam rising into the rafters. The mistress swept in, her silk dress whispering against the floor. "Work faster," Eleanor barked, her eyes cold as stone. "Do you know what this day means? Do not shame me, girl, or your back will feel the whip before night falls." Marianne bowed her head, murmuring, "Yes, mistress." But her thoughts were elsewhere. Beneath the wooden floorboard in the corner of the kitchen, her jar of powders waited. Foxglove, nightshade, rat poison, each one deadly on its own, together, a chorus of silent killers. She had spent weeks preparing, waiting, praying for this moment. And now, it was here. By midday, the wedding vows were spoken in the church. Bells rang, the crowd cheered, and Clarissa Beaumont, radiant in white lace, clutched the arm of her wealthy groom. They smiled, their faces lit with the glow of a new life. Behind them, guests clapped, throwing flower petals into the air. The master puffed his chest, proud of the alliance. Eleanor dabbed her eyes dramatically, basking in the admiration. Cutter stood at the back, sneering, his whip coiled even for this joyous occasion. And Marianne, she waited in the kitchen, her heart pounding with every chime of the bell. When the church bells fell silent, the guests returned to the plantation. Tables groaned beneath silver trays, goblets gleamed in candlelight, and music began to play. This was the moment the Beaumonts had been preparing for. The grand feast would seal their pride. For Marianne, it was the moment to strike. She slipped into the corner, her hands trembling only slightly as she pulled the jar from its hiding place. She sprinkled the fine powders with care, mixing them into the stew, dusting them over the roasted meats, kneading them into the pies. A pinch here, a handful there, not enough to kill instantly, but enough to spread sickness like wildfire across the hall. Enough to bring groans where there had been laughter, screams where there had been music. Every bite would carry her brother's memory. Every swallow would echo with Samuel's screams in the dirt. As she worked, another thought pierced her mind. What if the slaves were made to eat too? What if her vengeance spilled onto her own people? Her hands froze, ladle hovering above the pot. Fear prickled at her skin. But then she remembered slaves would not eat until the guests were finished. They would feast only on scraps, long after the poison had done its work. Her resolve hardened again. The overseer barged into the kitchen just as she finished. He snatched a piece of bread, stuffing it into his mouth with a sneer. "Pathetic girl," he muttered, crumbs falling down his chin. "Try harder, or you'll wish you were never born." Marianne bowed her head, but inside, she nearly smiled. He had taken his first step toward the grave without knowing it. By late afternoon, the guests had filled the hall. The great house rang with music and laughter. Marianne and the other kitchen slaves moved silently between tables, carrying trays, refilling goblets, serving plates heavy with food. No one looked at their faces. No one cared who brought the dishes. To the Beaumonts, they were invisible shadows. But Marianne knew better. Invisible shadows could strike hardest. She set a platter of roasted pork before the master. He raised his goblet, laughing loudly. "To my daughter, to her future, and to the strength of this family," he declared. Guests cheered, glasses clanked, and knives cut into meat. Eleanor took her first bite of pie. Clarissa, glowing in her gown, lifted a forkful of stew. Cutter, swaggering at the edge of the hall, gulped down a goblet of wine. And Marianne waited. At first, there was nothing. Only laughter, the scrape of knives, the swell of violins. She moved silently through the hall, refilling cups, her face calm though her heart thundered. Her eyes flicked from one guest to the next, waiting for the first sign. It came with a cough. The overseer paused mid-laugh, thumping his chest. His face reddened, his eyes watering. "Damn wine," he muttered, grabbing another goblet. He drank again, only to choke harder, coughing so violently his chair scraped back against the floor. Nearby, Eleanor Beaumont frowned, her hand trembling as she set down her spoon. Her face flushed, her lips quivered. She pressed a hand to her stomach. Then, a guest stumbled from his seat, pale as parchment. Another clutched her throat, gasping. The music faltered. Panic rippled through the hall. "What's happening?" cried Clarissa, her smile collapsing into fear as her groom bent double, clutching his stomach. Plates clattered, goblets spilled, and the joyous feast turned into chaos. Marianne stood at the edge of the hall, her tray balanced in her hands, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart surged with grim satisfaction. Her plan was working. Her food had become her voice, and her voice screamed vengeance. But even as she watched the overseer stagger, the mistress tremble, the master groan, fear clawed at her chest. Had she gone too far? Would they know it was her? Would she live to see the end of this night? The hall rang not with laughter now, but with screams. Guests collapsed, clawing at their throats, retching, moaning. Chairs overturned, silver platters crashed to the floor. The perfect Beaumont wedding had turned into a nightmare. And Marianne knew there was no turning back. The Beaumont plantation's grand hall, once a beacon of elegance and wealth, had transformed into a chamber of horror. The chandeliers blazed overhead, casting wild shadows on the walls as guests screamed, chairs toppled, and silver dishes clanged to the floor. The polished wooden table, set so carefully with crystal and lace, was now stained with spilled wine, vomit, and blood from bitten tongues. The music had stopped. The violinist stood frozen, bow trembling in his hand, before fleeing into the night. At the center of it all, Marianne stood silent. Her tray balanced in her hands like a shield, her dark eyes calm, yet burning with an inner fire. Around her, the mighty Beaumont family, masters of land, flesh, and cruelty, fell one by one, clutching their stomachs, gasping for air. For years, she had been their shadow, their servant, their slave. Tonight, she was their executioner. The overseer was the first to fall. Cutter staggered across the room, his breath ragged, sweat pouring down his face. "Poison," he choked, his voice hoarse. "The food, someone, His words broke into a wet cough, crimson flecks staining his lips. He tried to draw his whip, as if even in death he needed to assert control, but his hand shook too violently. The leather handle slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly to the ground. The sight filled Marianne with grim satisfaction. That whip had painted her back with scars, had torn into Samuel's flesh until he lay lifeless. Now, it was nothing more than a useless coil on the floor, powerless, like the man who had wielded it. Cutter fell to his knees, clutching the edge of the table. "Help me," he rasped, eyes bulging as foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. But no one moved. Guests were too busy collapsing themselves, retching onto the floor, screaming for salvation that would never come. With one last shudder, Cutter pitched forward, his face slamming into a silver platter, his lifeless eyes staring into the roasted meat he had mocked her for. The overseer was dead. But Marianne's gaze shifted to the mistress. Eleanor Beaumont, always so regal, always so cruel, sat trembling at the head of the table. Her face had gone pale, her lips bluish, and her jeweled fingers clutched the lace tablecloth. She locked eyes with Marianne, realization dawning in her gaze. "You," Eleanor gasped, her voice weak but dripping with venom. "It was you. You filthy, wretched." Marianne did not flinch. For years, Eleanor had delighted in her suffering, ordering beatings for the smallest mistakes, sneering at her pain, mocking Samuel's screams as if they were music. And now, Eleanor's body betrayed her, every bone trembling, every breath a struggle. "God will strike you down," Eleanor hissed, though her voice cracked mid-curse. She tried to rise, but her legs gave way, sending her sprawling to the floor. Her necklace, heavy with pearls, snapped and scattered across the wood like fallen stars. Marianne stepped closer, her shadow falling over the mistress's convulsing form. "I am God's strike," Marianne whispered, though only she heard the words. The mistress's body twisted, spasmed, and went still. The hall grew wilder by the moment. Guests clawed at their throats, stumbling over one another in desperation. Some fled toward the door, only to collapse on the steps outside. Others tried to vomit up the poison, their cries filling the night air. The once proud Beaumont feast had become a mass grave in the making. But not all fell so quickly. The master himself, Richard Beaumont, still clung to life. His face was red, sweat poured down his brow, and veins bulged in his temples. Yet he remained standing, gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled fury. His booming voice, though strained, cut through the chaos. "Seize her," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Marianne. "The slave girl, it's her. She did this." For a heartbeat, time froze. All eyes turned toward Marianne. Some of the weaker guests could barely raise their heads, but a handful of stronger men staggered upright, rage flashing in their eyes. Poison coursed through their veins, but vengeance still burned in their blood. Marianne's heart pounded. This was the moment she had feared, the moment her mask would shatter. But fear was a luxury she could not afford. She dropped the tray, its clang echoing through the hall like a battle cry, and seized the nearest weapon she could find, a carving knife glinting with candlelight. The men lunged, stumbling as their poisoned bodies betrayed them. Marianne slashed, the blade cutting across an arm, a chest. Blood splattered the white tablecloth, staining it red. One man groaned, collapsing onto the floor. Another reeled back, clutching his wound. The slaves who had served beside her stood frozen, eyes wide with shock and terror. Marianne turned to them, her voice sharp, commanding, "Run! Run now, or die here." They hesitated only a second before scattering, bolting through the kitchen doors, into the night. Their chains of silence had cracked. Marianne prayed they would find safety beyond the trees, away from the screams that still echoed inside the house. But she could not run. Not yet. Her eyes locked on Richard Beaumont, the man who had ordered Samuel's punishment, who had signed his death with nothing more than a nod. He loomed at the end of the table, still gripping it for strength. His breaths came in ragged bursts, his lips curled into a snarl. "You'll hang for this," he growled, spit flying from his mouth. "Every one of you filthy creatures will hang." Marianne's grip on the knife tightened. Slowly, deliberately, she began to walk toward him, her footsteps measured, echoing through the chaos. Guests writhed on the floor, groaning, gasping, some already still. But in that moment, only she and the master existed. Richard's eyes widened as she closed the distance. He reached for a pistol at his hip, but his poisoned hands fumbled, the weapon clattering uselessly to the floor. Marianne kicked it aside. "This is for Samuel," she said, her voice trembling with fury and grief. With one swift motion, she plunged the knife into his chest. His eyes bulged, his mouth opened in a silent gasp. He staggered, his hands clawing at the air, before collapsing backward onto the table. Plates shattered beneath his weight, goblets spilled, and the proud master of Beaumont plantation lay dead among the ruins of his own feast. Silence followed, thick, heavy, broken only by the groans of the dying. Marianne stood over him, her chest heaving, the knife slick with blood. For the first time in her life, she felt power, not the power of cruelty, but the power of justice. But her triumph was not without fear. She knew this night was far from over. Word would spread. The authorities would come. Retribution would follow. She turned toward Clarissa, the bride, who knelt on the floor, clutching her groom's lifeless body. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at Marianne. Her once beautiful gown was stained with vomit and wine, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. "Why?" Clarissa whispered, her voice breaking. "Why would you do this?" Marianne stared at her for a long moment, memories of Samuel's laughter, his screams, his broken body flashing through her mind. "Because you never saw us," Marianne replied softly. "And now you will never forget." She turned, the knife still in her hand, and strode toward the door. The night air rushed over her as she stepped outside, the moon casting its silver light upon the carnage within. Behind her, the Beaumont legacy lay shattered. Ahead of her, uncertainty loomed. But for the first time, she walked free, not in body, perhaps, but in spirit. The chains had broken. The night air was heavy, filled with the acrid scent of smoke and the faint sweetness of spilled wine drifting from the grand hall. Marianne's footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path as she moved away from the Beaumont mansion. Behind her, the plantation that had stood as a fortress of power and cruelty groaned with death. Candles still burned in the windows, flickering over scenes of horror that would haunt anyone who survived long enough to tell the tale. But Marianne did not look back. She walked into the night, the cool wind brushing her face like a hand of comfort she had never known. For the first time in years, no orders chased her, no overseer's whistle cut through the silence. Only the sound of her own breathing, heavy and alive, reminded her of her victory. In the slave quarters, whispers began to stir. The slaves who had fled the hall with her carried stories of what they had seen. Some trembled with fear, certain that soldiers would descend by dawn, hunting them down for vengeance. Others felt something different, something long buried beneath years of chains and whips. Hope. She did it, one whispered. She killed them. She killed the master and the overseer. God sent her, another murmured. Justice came at last. Marianne's name spread in hushed tones, carried on the night wind through the cabins, through the fields, through the very trees. To some, she was a savior. To others, a warning. But to all, she was a symbol. Proof that the Beaumonts, who seemed untouchable, could bleed. Yet Marianne knew what would come next. By morning, the news would reach the nearest town. Riders would be dispatched. Patrols would comb the woods. The authorities would not rest until every slave suspected of rebellion was punished, and punished brutally. Plantation owners feared nothing more than the spark of uprising, and she had lit a fire with her own hands. As dawn broke, the sky bruised with purple and red, the Beaumont estate lay eerily silent. Dozens of bodies remained where they had fallen, guests in their finest gowns, servants who had touched the poisoned food, even children who had sipped the tainted wine. The wedding feast had become a graveyard. The chandeliers, once dazzling, hung above corpses sprawled across velvet chairs and blood-stained carpets. When neighbors arrived, drawn by rumors of chaos, they found the master's lifeless body stretched across the table, his eyes frozen in shock. The overseer lay face down in his own blood. The mistress's pearls littered the floor like scattered tears. And Clarissa, the bride, sat numb in her ruined gown, clutching her husband's corpse as flies began to buzz in the morning heat. The scene was so grotesque, so complete, that even hardened men whispered of curses, of divine wrath. But soon the truth spread. It was no curse. It was the work of a slave. The punishment was swift and merciless. Troops scoured the countryside, dragging dozens into custody. Innocent men and women were beaten, questioned, tortured for confessions they could not give. Some were hanged in the town square, their bodies left swinging as a warning to others. The fear of rebellion demanded blood, and the authorities were eager to spill it. Yet Marianne remained elusive. Some said she had fled into the swamps, vanishing into the thick fog where no white man dared to follow. Others swore she had disguised herself, traveling north with passing traders, inching her way toward freedom. And some whispered that she had not left at all, that she lingered near the plantation, watching from the shadows, a ghost haunting the ruins of the family she destroyed. Her fate became a mystery, woven into songs sung softly in the quarters, passed down like scripture. For many slaves, her story was not one of terror, but of triumph. They sang of the cook who fed poison to the masters who turned a day of celebration into a night of reckoning. They sang of her courage, her vengeance, her escape. But others feared the story, for it invited retribution. Plantation owners tightened their grips. Overseers grew more ruthless. Chains clinked louder in the fields, and punishments became harsher. The masters wanted slaves to tremble at Marianne's name, not be inspired by it. Still, her legacy could not be buried. Years later, as whispers of abolition spread, her tale returned again and again. Around fires at night, elders would recall the wedding that ended in blood. They told of Marianne's steady hands stirring poison into stew, of her eyes watching calmly as the powerful fell. They told of her final words to the bride, "Because you never saw us, and now you will never forget." Those words lingered like smoke, carried forward even when names blurred and faces faded. They became a haunting truth, echoing through generations, that the enslaved were not invisible, that their suffering demanded to be seen, that their vengeance, when it came, would be unforgettable. And so Marianne's story was not just a story of revenge. It was a story of broken chains, chains not shattered in open rebellion, but dissolved in silence, in the secrecy of a kitchen, in the quiet rage of a woman who refused to remain powerless. What happened to Marianne herself may forever remain unknown. Perhaps she died in the swamps, her body swallowed by the earth she longed to own. Perhaps she escaped, living out her days in freedom, telling her story only in the secrecy of trusted friends. Or perhaps she was caught, buried in an unmarked grave, her name never recorded by those who feared her too much to let her live in memory. But her act, the act of a cook slave who poisoned an entire family on their wedding day, could not be erased. It lived on as both warning and prophecy. And as night fell again over the silent ruins of the Beaumont estate, one truth remained. In the place where laughter turned to screams, where chains were broken by spoon and by knife, a slave once stood and proved that even the most fragile hand could bring the mighty to their knees. Her story ends in shadows, but her legacy lingers like smoke in the air. A whisper, a warning, a reminder. that those who live by cruelty may one day feast on their own destruction.